She was 14 years old when the cameras first found her face. Not yet a woman, not quite still a girl, standing inside a television studio in Hollywood, with braces barely off her teeth, and a dream still too large for her small frame to carry. She had no idea that the role she was about to begin would follow her for the rest of her life. A character named Laura, who would become, for 30 million people, more real than anyone they had ever known. For nearly 5 decades, Genie Francis has been the heartbeat of American daytime television. As Laura Spencer on General Hospital, she did not simply play a role. She became an institution, a face so familiar to so many generations of viewers that separating the woman from the legend has always been nearly impossible. The wedding of Luke and Laura in November of 1981 drew more viewers than any daytime drama event before or since. 30 million people, holding their breath, watching a fictional love story as though it were their own. But behind that glittering crown lies a story not glamorous, but devastating. A hidden battlefield of loneliness, addiction, professional exile, body shame, grief, and the kind of courage that never once made the headlines because it happened in the silence between takes, in the dark corners of her private life, and in the mirror she spent decades afraid to look into. The world has known her character's triumphs for 50 years. Few are prepared to face the haunting truth she carried behind them. If Laura Spencer ever gave you comfort, ever made you believe in love, leave a like as a tribute to the woman who poured her real pain into every frame of it. It is heartbreaking when the beginning of a legend is marked not by protection, but by a stolen childhood. She was born Eugenie Ann Francis on May 26, 1962, in Englewood, New Jersey, the daughter of 2 people who understood the intoxication of performance. Her father, Ivor Francis, was a working stage actor of Canadian and English descent, a man who moved between Broadway productions and television sets with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to love the craft more than the applause. Her mother, Rosemary Daly, had been an actress and model, a woman of Lithuanian heritage whose beauty was matched only by the restlessness that seemed to follow artistic households. Genie grew up alongside an older brother, a younger brother, and a half-sister from her father's first marriage. A family portrait that appeared complete from the outside, though the fractures underneath would take decades to fully surface. When she was 7, the family relocated to Los Angeles, the city that promised everything and demanded everything in return. It was there that Genie first understood what her father's world truly meant. Not the romance of theater, but the grinding uncertainty of a career built on auditions, callbacks, and the cruel indifference of casting directors who saw not a child, but a commodity. She watched her father navigate that world with grace, and she decided, with the clear-eyed certainty of someone far too young for such resolve, that she would do the same. At 14, the braces came off. She asked her father to take her headshot to his agent. A brief appearance on the ABC primetime series Family followed. And then, in the fall of 1976, came the phone call that would define the next half-century of her life. A part-time role on General Hospital, the struggling ABC daytime drama that a bold new executive producer named Gloria Monty was preparing to transform into something the television world had never seen. Genie Francis joined the cast at 14 years old. What began as a peripheral character named Laura Vining, the biological daughter of the show's Dr. Leslie Williams, was about to become something no one could have predicted. Because Monty saw in this quiet, blonde teenager something the camera already loved without being told to: a rawness, an openness, a quality of absorbing and reflecting emotion that made the viewer feel instinctively that they were watching a real person and not a performance. The ratings responded immediately, and so the role expanded, and with it, the pressure. Laura's storylines grew darker, more complex, more demanding. The schedule became relentless. Because she worked full-time, teen Genie could not attend school and was tutored on set instead, which meant that the world she existed in contained only one community: adults, producers, directors, crew members, co-stars, all of them years older, all of them operating inside an industry with rhythms and appetites that a 14-year-old had no architecture to understand or withstand. She had no peers. She had no after-school conversations, no Friday nights at the movies with classmates, no ordinary adolescence to retreat into when the cameras stopped rolling. She later described those years with a candor that still carries weight. My life was absolutely horrible at that time. It was so lonely and so painful and so desperate. And then came the directive that would mark her relationship with her own body for the next 4 decades. The producers decided that Laura needed to lose weight. A diet was imposed, not a gentle one. Her character was put on a strict regimen, and the young actress, eager to comply and desperate to belong, followed instructions that put her health at genuine risk. That, Genie would later say with bleak precision, was her entrance into the dieting world. A door that, once opened, she would spend the rest of her life trying to close behind her. By 1979, the show had introduced Luke Spencer, played by Anthony Geary, a charismatic, combustible actor who became the defining force of a storyline that would consume everything around it. The character of Laura was recentered on Luke. Their chemistry was undeniable. Their pairing became a cultural event. And on November 17, 1981, the wedding of Laura to Luke Spencer became the most-watched daytime drama event in the history of American television, drawing 30 million viewers and earning a cover story in Newsweek magazine. For the world watching, it was a fairy tale. For the 19-year-old living it, it was something else entirely. The isolation had not lifted. The pressure had only multiplied. Fame arrived not as liberation, but as amplification of loneliness, of scrutiny, of the hollow feeling that comes from being known by millions of people who do not know you at all. The drug culture of the era surrounded her on set, and Genie, desperate to belong inside the only adult world she had ever known, was pulled into it. She would later admit, with the measured honesty of someone who had spent years earning that clarity, that she knew almost immediately she had a problem. And yet the knowledge did not stop her. Nothing stopped her, because nothing about her circumstances had changed. She was still the girl who had traded her childhood for a camera. She was still utterly alone inside the most famous love story in daytime television. And the substance did what nothing else had managed to do. It numbed the ache, even briefly, even dangerously. By late 1981, her addiction had reached a point that could no longer be hidden or managed. After an episode of collapse that sent her to the hospital, she stepped away from her 5-year role and entered a recovery program. She was 19 years old. The girl who had walked onto that set at 14 with a photograph and a dream walked off it at 19 with scars that the cameras had never caught, and a reckoning with herself that would take the better part of 40 more years to complete. Recovery, for Genie Francis, did not arrive as a single defining moment. It came slowly, unevenly, in fits and retreats, the way healing always does when the wound runs as deep as hers did. She was 19 years old, barely out of the institution that had consumed her entire adolescence, and she was already famous enough that her absence from it became news. The show she had left behind was not gracious about the departure. She told an interviewer in 1983 with a directness that barely concealed the hurt underneath it. "They never really gave me an exit. It was unfair to me and unfair to the fans." Those words carried more than professional disappointment. They carried the quiet devastation of someone who had given a show her childhood and been handed back a rushed farewell. She returned briefly in 1983, and again in 1984, limited appearances carefully constructed around Anthony Geary's own exit from the series. Each return felt more like a courtesy than a homecoming, the show borrowing her face when it suited the story, then releasing her back into a professional landscape that had no clear place for her. The girl who had once been television's most watched bride was now, at 22, a young woman navigating a career that the industry had already quietly begun to define as something behind her rather than ahead. The years that followed were a wandering. She was not forgotten. A name like Laura Spencer does not fade easily from public memory. But she was displaced, circling the edges of an industry that wanted her fame without quite knowing where to put it. She took a role on Days of Our Lives as Diana Colville in 1987, a move she later admitted carried a cost she had not anticipated. The industry, she would confess years afterward, viewed it as a step backward, a return to daytime after her brief flirtation with primetime miniseries work had seemed to promise something larger. "From that point on, my career was tarnished in a way," she said quietly. "It was changed." What stung most was not the role itself, but the realization that the shows taking her on wanted the brand of her name, not the depth of her craft. She was being rented, not invested in. By 1990, she had moved again, this time to All My Children, where she spent 2 years playing Sarah Connor, a character whose storylines demanded a kind of emotional weight that finally gave her somewhere to put the complexity she had been carrying for a decade. The work was good, the recognition was modest, and all the while, the personal architecture of her life was quietly being rebuilt in ways no camera captured. The foundation of that rebuilding was a man she had first encountered in 1983 on the set of a television movie called Bare Essence. An actor named Jonathan Frakes, who had looked at the 20-year-old Genie and decided with characteristic self-awareness that she was too young for him. He was 10 years older, already seasoned, and sensible enough to know the difference between attraction and timing. They parted. They worked separately. And then, in 1985, filming the Civil War miniseries North and South in the heat of Charleston and Natchez, something shifted. "We've been together ever since our first date," Frakes would say decades later, still unable to entirely account for how fortunate he had been. "Somehow, she wasn't too young for me anymore." They became engaged in 1986. They married on May 28, 1988, 2 days after Genie's 26th birthday. It was not a celebrity spectacle. It was a quiet, private commitment between two people who had both spent enough time in the machinery of fame to understand how little it protected a person from the ordinary human need to be truly known. Frakes would later describe standing by her through the years of her addiction recovery with a simplicity that said everything. He was there. Not as a rescuer, not as a manager of her image, but as a man who had chosen her and continued choosing her when the choosing required something real. The marriage gave her a steadiness she had never had before, and it was inside that steadiness that her grief found its proper place when, in October 1986, the same year she was learning to build a new life, her father died. Ivor Francis, the actor who had first handed her a photograph and walked her into an agent's office, who had loved the world of performance enough to pass it to his daughter, and later appeared in a small role on the very show that had made her famous, died in Sherman Oaks, California, at 67 years old, after a series of strokes. He had watched enough of his daughter's rise to see that she was surviving. He did not live long enough to see her finally land. She returned to General Hospital in October 1993. this time not for a limited run or a contractual courtesy, but as a sustained commitment that would last 9 years. The reunion with Anthony Geary as Luke and Laura drew the kind of attention that reminded everyone, including the network, exactly what they had been missing. The show's creative energy sharpened around their presence. In 1997, Francis earned a Soap Opera Digest Award for Outstanding Lead Actress. In 1996 and 1997, during a storyline involving the return of the Cassadine family, she delivered work that drew an Emmy nomination, a recognition that felt like partial vindication for the decade of wandering that had preceded it. But the industry had not finished testing her. In 2002, after 9 years back on the show, she requested more flexible scheduling. A reasonable ask from a woman who was now a wife and the mother of a son born in 1994 and a daughter born in 1997. The network refused. She walked. And once again, the exit was not graceful. She later admitted to feeling deeply unappreciated in the years before she left, having poured everything into a storyline involving the death of her on-screen son, Lucky, and receiving no Emmy nomination in return. "That was a really big blow for me," she said. "I wish I could have bounced back from that better." She came back in 2006 for a single, luminous month, a brief reprise to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Luke and Laura wedding. The performance was quiet and devastating in the best possible sense, the work of a woman who no longer needed to prove anything, and therefore proved everything. In June 2007, that 1 month of work earned her the Daytime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actress, the industry's formal acknowledgement, 45 years into her life and 30 years into her career, that she had always been exactly as good as her most devoted viewers knew. She accepted the award with the steady grace of someone who understood, by then, that recognition and worth are not the same thing. One had arrived late. The other had been hers all along. There is a particular cruelty that arrives not with a single blow, but with the accumulation of small erosions, the slow, grinding weight of being measured against a version of yourself that the world refuses to let age, change, or rest. For Genie Francis, that weight had a name. It was Laura, and carrying her for nearly 5 decades meant carrying, alongside the love and the legacy, a set of expectations about how a woman's body should look, how her face should hold, and how grateful she ought to be for the privilege of the burden. It had started, as so many of her deepest wounds did, when she was still a teenager. The producers had decided that Laura needed to be thinner. A diet was imposed. The regimen she was put on was not simply restrictive. It was dangerous, a version of liquid protein supplementation that had, by that point, already been linked to deaths. She complied. She was 14 years old, new to the industry, desperate to belong, and surrounded by adults who treated her body as a production concern rather than a human reality. That compliance cost her something she would spend the next 4 decades trying to reclaim: a straightforward, peaceful relationship with food and with herself. "I'm in a business that wants me to be that toothpick figure girl," she said years later, with the measured exhaustion of someone who had said some version of it 100 times before. And I'm not. The statement was not self-pity. It was autobiography. From the age of 14 onward, her weight became a public conversation she never consented to. A running commentary that followed her through every departure and return, every contract renegotiation, every appearance under studio lights that were designed, as studio lights always are, to reveal rather than conceal. The cycles were relentless. Years of careful discipline followed by the collapse that always came when the emotional architecture underneath grew too strained to hold. She admitted, with the kind of honesty that requires real courage in a public figure, that she was an emotional eater, that food had become, like the substance she had reached for at 19, a way of managing a pain that had no other outlet. "When you get that much out of shape," she said in one of her most candid interviews, "there's just a hopelessness that sets in. It's awful. It's just awful." She was not describing vanity. She was describing the exhaustion of fighting a battle on multiple fronts simultaneously: the industry's gaze, her own shame, and the relentless metabolic reality of a body that had been put through cycles of restriction and recovery since adolescence. In 2014, she began working with a structured nutrition program and lost 40 pounds. The physical shift was visible, but what she spoke about most was not the external change. It was the interior one, the lifting of a fog she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was not simply the weather. "I'm not so tired," she said. "I am not so depressed. I start to get interested in my own life again." Those words, simple as they were, revealed the true cost of what she had been living with, not just a struggle with weight, but a years-long dimming of the self. And then came 2018. In that year, the producers of General Hospital made a decision that Genie Francis had not been prepared for and could not fully absorb. Laura Spencer, the character she had inhabited for more than 40 years, the woman she had in many ways grown up alongside, was being dropped to recurring status. No farewell arc, no ceremonial send-off, a quiet administrative reduction that communicated with brutal efficiency that the institution which had defined her life had decided, for the moment, that it could manage without her. She did not try to minimize what it did to her. "I got very depressed," she said simply. "It lasted for maybe, I don't know, 3 months. The depression was not only professional grief, though that alone would have been legitimate. It was the reopening of something older and deeper. The wound of the girl who had given everything to a world that had never quite guaranteed it would hold her in return. She had left before, had been pushed to the margins before, had watched the industry use her name without honoring her worth before. But this time, she was 66 years old, and the stakes felt different. Not just a career setback, a reckoning with what she had built her identity around for half a century. Her fans, as they had done before, refused to accept the decision quietly. The response on social media was immediate and sustained. A chorus of voices insisting that Laura Spencer, without Genie Francis, was not Laura Spencer at all. The network listened. She was brought back on a full contract. But the 3 months between the demotion and the return had left a mark that the reinstatement could not entirely erase. She had seen, again, how precarious her footing inside the institution she had devoted her life to truly was. How easily the ground could shift. What made her survival of that period remarkable was not the outcome. The contract restored, the character returned. But what she chose to do with the understanding, it forced on her. She began, in the years that followed, to speak more directly about the emotional cost of the work, about the loneliness of a career spent inside a single role, about the way that playing one woman for 50 years could make it genuinely difficult to locate the self that existed separately from that woman. "I've had to justify it for so many years," she said of one of General Hospital's most controversial storylines, and in that sentence, about a fictional event, lived the truth of something much larger. The exhaustion of a woman who had spent decades explaining herself to an industry and an audience that often forgot she was a person first and a character second. The toll, taken in full, was considerable. A body that had been subject to the industry's demands since the age of 14, cycling through restriction and recovery for 4 decades. A career defined by a single character so famous that escaping her, even briefly, had always come at a cost. A series of departures and returns that each carried their own particular humiliation. The suggestion, implicit in every exit, that she was dispensable. And underneath all of it, the original wound. The girl who had grown up on camera, without a childhood, without peers, without the ordinary scaffolding of adolescence that teaches a person how to stand inside their own life. She had survived all of it. Not gracefully, not without visible damage, but with a tenacity that the cameras had captured whether they meant to or not. In nearly 2,000 episodes across 5 decades, there was not a single one in which Genie Francis had not brought something real to the frame. The audience knew it, and slowly, painfully, she was learning to know it too. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a montage or a triumphant score. It shows up quietly in the ordinary morning, in the decision to return to a set that once diminished you, to speak honestly in an interview about the things that nearly undid you, to hold your husband's hand and mean it after 37 years. That is the strength Genie Francis built, not from triumph, but from endurance. Not from immunity to pain, but from the long, unglamorous practice of surviving it. The marriage to Jonathan Frakes became the truest measure of that endurance. In a profession that consumes relationships the way fire consumes kindling, theirs held. Not without difficulty, she had been candid enough over the years to acknowledge that no long marriage, especially one navigating 2 full careers inside the entertainment industry, moves through decades without seasons of genuine hardship. Her grandmother's advice, which she passed on with the directness of someone who had tested it. To stay married a long time, you have to be willing to have a couple of really bad years, and you may have to have them more than once. It was not a romantic prescription. It was a practical one, born from the understanding that commitment is not a feeling, but a repeated decision. Frakes, for his part, had grown into one of the most respected actor-directors in television, his career in the Star Trek franchise running parallel to her decades on General Hospital. 2 people who had each become, in their separate spheres, genuinely indispensable. What they built at home, away from both, was quieter and more durable than either public legacy. Their son Jameson, born in 1994, grew into a fisherman and conservationist, a man who chose the natural world over the entertainment one, a choice that both parents spoke of with unmistakable pride. Their daughter Eliza, born in 1997, became a playwright and actress, even appearing on General Hospital herself, a moment of continuity that carried the particular tenderness of a family story folding back on itself. The institution that had taken so much from Genie Francis as a child was now, in a quieter chapter, welcoming her daughter. The losses of these later years were real and accumulated. Tyler Christopher, who had played her on-screen son Nicholas for years, a young man of striking talent and painful vulnerability, died in October 2023 at 50 years old. When asked about him, Genie did not reach for the softening phrase. She said what she knew, that he was a beautiful angel, so vulnerable, so pure. And then, with the unflinching honesty of someone who had watched addiction from both inside and outside, some people don't make it to the other side of recovery. The sentence landed without self-pity and without editorializing. It was simply true, and she said it as someone who understood exactly what it cost. Then came December 14, 2025. Anthony Geary, Luke Spencer, her leading man, the man who had been, for better and for darker, the defining professional relationship of her life, died in Amsterdam at 78 years old. She woke that morning having spent the night dreaming of her own mortality, went into her husband's arms, and then received the call from the show's executive producer, confirming what something in her had already registered. She had felt it in her sleep. The bond between them, formed in the crucible of a television phenomenon that neither of them had asked for and that had shaped both of their lives irrevocably, had been that strange and that real. Her tribute was not managed or measured. It poured out in 4 consecutive posts, unpolished, present, and entirely hers. He was a powerhouse as an actor, she wrote, shoulder to shoulder with the greats. No star burned brighter. Working with him was always exciting. You never knew what might happen. And then, at the end, the line that said everything about what 50 years of shared history actually feel like when it ends. He spoiled me for leading men for the rest of my life. I am crushed. I will miss him terribly, but I was so lucky to be his partner. Somehow, somewhere, we are connected to each other because I felt him leave last night. Good night, sweet prince. Good night. In February 2026, when General Hospital aired its formal tribute episode, Genie Francis stood in the center of it. Not as a guest, not as a relic, but as the woman who had always been the emotional center of the story. Laura's words in that episode were not written for the cameras, but felt as though they had been carried inside Genie Francis for decades, waiting for the right moment to surface. I know you're not here on this earth with us anymore, she said, but Luke, you never left me. Not once. I feel your presence when life gets too heavy, when I feel like I can't go one more step. It's your voice that I hear calling me angel, reminding me of who I am. Then somehow, I find the strength, and I do go on. That is the sentence that captures Genie Francis most precisely. Not the 30 million viewers. Not the daytime Emmy on the shelf, earned in 2007 for a single month of work, that finally gave the industry something it could formally acknowledge. Not the nearly 2,000 episodes, or the 5 decades, or the title of soap opera royalty that had followed her since she was barely old enough to drive. It is the line about finding the strength to go on, because that is what her entire story, stripped of its celebrity architecture, has actually been about. She is 63 years old. She is still on the show. She still brings something real to every frame she inhabits. The marriage is intact, and more than intact. It is, by every available account, a source of genuine warmth and stability in a life that had precious little of either for a very long time. The children are grown and building lives that are recognizably their own. The Emmy sits somewhere in a house in California, and the woman herself, who entered a television studio at 14 without a childhood to lean on, has arrived at 63 with something far more valuable than the fame that found her before she was ready for it. She has arrived at herself. That is the legacy no camera caught and no contract guaranteed. Not Laura Spencer, not the wedding, not the ratings, but the woman who survived all of it. The loneliness, the addiction, the industry's indifference, the grief, the cycles of departure and return, and chose, again and again, to go on. In every scar, in every silence, in every honest word she has spoken about the life behind the character, Genie Francis offers the same quiet reminder that the greatest performance is not the one the audience applauds, but the one you give when no one is watching, simply by enduring, simply by returning, simply by being, against considerable odds, still here.